Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. Among the many UFO encounters reported in Italy, few have sparked as much enduring debate as the case of Pier Fortunato Zanfretta, a Genoa-area night watchman whose experiences in the late 1970s challenged both public perception and official inquiry. What began as a routine patrol in the hills above Tarraglia quickly evolved into one of the most thoroughly discussed and controversial UFO contact cases in European ufology. Zanfretta's story centers on a series of nighttime encounters that started in December 1978. On one occasion, he reported seeing a disc-like object illuminated by bright lights and described beings over 3 meters tall with unusual physical features, a description that left even seasoned investigators uneasy. Within minutes, he was found disoriented, in shock, and uttering the words, "They are not men," a phrase that would come to define the case in ufological circles. What set this case apart was not just the dramatic nature of the claims, but the depth of documentation, eyewitness reports, impressions in the ground, contemporaneous police files, and later sessions of regressive hypnosis. Italian law enforcement and medical professionals were involved in assessing Zanfretta's condition and credibility, making it more than an isolated witness claim. At the center of the modern narrative stands Rino Di Stefano, a Genoese journalist and ufology researcher who has dedicated decades to investigating the Zanfretta phenomenon. Di Stefano's work, from early press coverage to books such as The Zanfretta Case and contributions to periodicals, helped transform this episode from a local curiosity into a cornerstone of Italian UFO research. His interviews, analysis, and persistent documentation provide one of the most comprehensive frameworks for understanding why this case continues to matter. Here on Compelling Topics, we've already met Rino Di Stefano in the monthly Portraits episode dedicated to Ettore Majorana. But in this episode of the Italian phenomenon, we revisit that night in Tarraglia, explore how the case was documented and debated, and hear from one of the leading experts who has shaped its legacy. We are talking about the case of the former night watchman Pier Fortunato Zanfretta 47 years later. It seems almost paradoxical to me that, after all these years, so much water under the bridge, suddenly there's been a revival of this case, not only in Italy, but internationally. For example, the first to contact me, asking permission to use my material from my website and book, the English version, was History Channel. And this year alone, I received 3 more requests from the United States. I'll show you something. It's a book that came out a while ago. If you look at the central image, it's precisely the Zanfretta case. In fact, in this book, published in the United States, the Zanfretta case is mentioned and considered one of the 10 most famous UFO cases in the world. Returning to Italy, this interest probably comes from the younger generations. I don't see another reason. Some people have realized how emblematic this case is. I also, unfortunately, find myself involved in certain descriptions and narratives because they consider me, using terms I've read in new books on this story, the father of the Zanfretta case. They try to understand why, 47 years ago, I, as a young man, became interested in a case completely outside my professional focus. To give you an example, I returned to Italy in June 1977 and had just finished university. The Zanfretta case happened in December 1978. My first role at that time, when I joined the oldest daily newspaper in Italy, the Corriere Mercantile in Genoa, was as a crime reporter. I started my career covering serious crimes, not only murders, which as you can imagine any crime reporter deals with, but especially, given the period between 1977 and 1980, terrorism and the Red Brigades. I went 5 times to collect messages from the Red Brigades, followed daily events in that area, and unfortunately, there were also frequent murders, not only in Genoa, but elsewhere in Italy. I was focused solely on that. Then, suddenly, this story of the night watchman appeared. One day, In early December 1978, around the 7th or 8th, the night watchman claimed to have been abducted by UFOs. People asked me why I covered this story, since I wasn't interested in UFOs, especially as many of my colleagues simply shrugged it off. When I studied journalism, one of the first things I was taught was that a story, regardless of its type, if it's true and substantiated, must be covered. What my professors told me was that a news story is like a pregnant woman. It either is or it isn't. If the news is true and documented, you must report it. That's what a journalist does. A journalist deals with everyday reality and the events that happen. So when Pier Fortunato Zanfretta's case happened, honestly, I didn't care whether UFOs were real or not. The UFO aspect was secondary. What mattered was the man, the person, the human drama he was experiencing unwillingly. He found himself not as the subject, as many think, but as the object of this story. He claimed to have been abducted and taken aboard these alleged spacecraft. What interested me and drove me to cover the case was that the Carabinieri and the judiciary were already involved. To be precise, the Valbisagno Vigilance Institute, where Zanfretta worked, filed a complaint immediately after the first event for the assault their employee had suffered from unknown assailants. Following this complaint, the Carabinieri investigated and issued a detailed report on what had happened. They found 52 witnesses who had seen in the skies above Torriglia, where the event occurred in the Marzano area, a large disc-shaped luminous object. Among these witnesses were reliable figures: the mayor, the parish priest, a game warden. They spoke to the Carabinieri, not a journalist. The Carabinieri recorded their statements and sent the report to the judiciary. The Genoa Public Prosecutor's Office then opened an official investigation, which continued for 11 months and ultimately closed the case for lack of evidence. After all, what could they do? There weren't Martians harassing the poor night watchman, who was just doing his job in an isolated villa in the mountains. That day, the weather was terrible, bitter cold and frost covering the entire vegetation: grass, trees, plants. The Carabinieri even found something tangible: a large semicircular footprint, almost horseshoe-shaped, about 3 square meters, as if something heavy, what they described almost like a helicopter, had landed on the frozen lawn. So, all the elements were there. I repeat, now, 47 years later, new books are coming out and there's renewed discussion about the Zanfretta case. I've seen posts on social media from some people in the field, as well as various articles. Many of the main figures are no longer with us, but the moment is positive because the story is being discussed again. By the way, I mentioned some time ago that a TV series or a film seems to be in preparation by a production company. I'm not authorized to give any details because they've contacted not only me, but also Zanfretta's family and Zanfretta himself. It seems that, at the beginning of 2026, something will happen in this regard, whether on the big screen or on television, telling the story of what happened to Pier Fortunato Zanfretta. That's basically the topic we're discussing tonight. When I first encountered him, my first question was, a 26-year-old man, married with 2 children, suddenly seems to lose his mind. He was terrified when the Carabinieri found him, as were his family members who had sent a patrol to search for him. He wasn't thinking clearly at all. He was completely terrified. He had a reputation for being serious and very courageous. Despite being of small stature, he was extremely brave. He had even been involved in shootouts before, something the station commander in Torriglia could attest to. For instance, one time in San Pier di Arena, a district of Genoa, there was a shootout with criminals, and both the Carabinieri and Zanfretta participated. He wasn't someone who backed down from danger. I kept thinking, is it possible that a young man, married with 2 children, working night shifts to earn extra money, gets caught up in a story about UFOs and strange events, risking his job? At any moment, his employers could have said, "You're not in your right mind, so we're letting you go." But he never considered that. He simply found himself in an entirely anomalous situation, as the object of the story, not the subject. The subject, in this case, was a mysterious and alleged alien presence supposedly abducting him. As a journalist, I understood immediately that this story, to be credible, didn't make sense. Aliens showing up and taking a night watchman away? It didn't work. When I met him, he was very reserved, shy, and confused. It took me a while to gain his trust and understand what had happened to him. At that point, inspired by a friend, Dr. Alfredo Ferraro, vice president of the Genoa branch of RAI at the time, he suggested trying regressive hypnosis to help Zanfretta recall the events. Even when I later wrote the book, I made it clear that hypnosis cannot guarantee the truth. It's a subjective, not objective, tool. People may inadvertently mix imagination with memory, so what comes out under hypnosis isn't necessarily the reality of events. From the very first articles I wrote, I tried, as much as possible, to tell the story scrupulously, reporting the facts, documenting testimonies, describing the environment. By environment, I don't just mean the landscape or physical features, but also the people living there. Peoples of Tariglia were naturally cautious in speaking to a journalist. Very few were willing to come forward. I recall one important testimony. The wife of the owner of the only hotel in Tariglia, the Albergo della Posta. She said that on that night, she saw two carabinieri supporting Zanfretta, one on each side, as they brought him to the town square. He had just gotten out of the car and they were trying to help him, offering him some water. He was completely sober. By the way, he didn't drink alcohol. This woman said he seemed catatonic, utterly without willpower, like a weight being carried. And we're talking about a young man in the prime of his life, fully capable of walking, but out of sheer terror, he couldn't stand on his own. This man was so terrified that he couldn't even speak, couldn't express himself in any way. It was a long and difficult process. Contrary to what I expected, the story lasted 2 years because he underwent regressive hypnosis multiple times. He was also taken to Milan to see a specialist, where he was given pentothal, the so-called truth serum, which removes all mental inhibitions, allowing the mind to recount events freely. So, in total, there were 6 recorded sessions over 2 years. I also had direct experiences, following the carabinieri and becoming friends with the station brigadier, who later became a marshal and was transferred. What impressed me most was the number of witnesses. I had never seen so many people recount the same version of events. One witness was the brigadier himself. Once, while driving from Tariglia to Genoa to watch a movie with his wife and a friend, they saw above the trees a large luminous flying object. This was recorded and later recounted on camera after he had retired. He described it as a big, bright disc spinning slowly, with what looked like small lights above a cabin, about 50 meters above the trees, so very close, not just a light in the sky, something concrete. After a few minutes, it spun rapidly and then, in a flash, disappeared over the horizon. So everyone seemed crazy, and Zanfretta himself seemed mad. It struck me as strange, but when I wrote the book, I made sure to include both the lights and the shadows, everything that didn't quite fit in the story. Over the years, this work became the basis for subsequent accounts, many of which were outright nonsense. Names were invented, events never happened. They looked more like novels than investigations. Some even claimed these were journalistic inquiries, investigations done 47 years later, fabricating colleagues and situations Zanfretta had never been part of. I also want to mention a recently published book that examines the Zanfretta case from a sociological perspective. The case started as a local phenomenon in Genoa and its surroundings, then gained wider attention after articles were published, both mine and those of other journalists less inclined to take it seriously. It's easy to make jokes when UFOs are involved. I remember the brigadier showing me their operational manual, page 92 bis, which gives precise instructions on how carabinieri should behave in the presence of unidentified flying objects. It's clear that these events aren't discussed officially because no one wants to terrify anyone. No one wants to say that somewhere 3-meter-tall beings might appear and abduct anyone. They understand that. But these events, an unidentified flying object, regardless of whether you give it a sci-fi interpretation or not, can be anything that doesn't reveal itself. Regarding normal consciousness, being present to oneself, Zanfretta would say absolutely nothing. Even after 6 hypnosis sessions, he didn't recount anything outside of hypnosis. During these sessions, he sometimes gave striking details. I always kept in mind that hypnosis can be fallible, so it might not reflect reality. I carried out checks, for instance during his last disappearance, when his colleagues found him. I went to the Passo della Cala, near the village of Rossi, where Zanfretta had said in hypnosis that he left small slips of paper, like the ones security guards place under doors, to mark his path, creating a trail like Tom Thumb, so colleagues could locate him. The next morning, I went there and found the slips exactly as he had described, about 20 pieces scattered along the path. This was a positive confirmation, something verifiable, not a memory implantation or feeling. Dr. Mauro Moretti, the hypnotherapist who conducted most of Zanfretta's sessions, was very careful. He didn't lead the patient. He simply had him describe events as they happened. I attended all sessions, alongside other people including Giovanni Casiba, the commander of the Val Bisagno security guards. We always looked for rational explanations for what Zanfretta recounted. One striking example involved Guadalajara. During hypnosis, Zanfretta communicated with an alien interlocutor who said they had come from Spain and had scared some people. All sessions were recorded, so this is documented. I remember working at the Corriere Mercantile in my early career. The day after the hypnosis, around 10 a.m., we were connected to international news agencies, including ANSA in Rome. A flash came from Madrid. The previous day, near Guadalajara, a dentist driving with his family was chased by a large luminous object, so close it nearly touched the roof of the car. The dentist lost control and ended up in a ditch. Luckily, there were no serious injuries. The coincidence that Zanfretta the night before had mentioned Spain and people being frightened by a luminous flying disc was extremely curious. Zanfretta was also examined by Cesare Mazzotti, the father of Italian psychoanalysis. During an on-air hypnosis session, Mazzotti confirmed that Zanfretta was certainly not lying. Dr. Moretti also believed he was reliving real experiences. Questions arise. What did they want? What was the larger plan? Usually in these cases, you hear about men in black or state secrets trying to suppress information. Personally, I never saw any men in black. The events themselves concluded without definitive answers. Witnesses included security guards, public officials, and others. The case became almost mythical. A recently published book, which I'm convinced was written by a medical specialist, examines the case in detail. In my book, I carefully documented all names of participants, all of whom never denied their involvement. Official records exist in the Carabinieri reports, sent to multiple ministries and agencies. The credibility of these reports was consistently high, and the witnesses remain compelling. The last time I heard from Zanfretta was many years ago. It must be remembered that he was traumatized. He gained nothing from this story. His life was ruined. He lost his family, got divorced, and lost his job. Fortunately, a religious institution helped him find employment, but the personal cost was immense. By the way, speaking of strange things, we also have to talk about, let's say, noble actions. A few years ago, while working at this institute, there was a small fire. Since several elderly residents were living there, the fire could have been fatal, not so much because of the flames, but because of the smoke, which made it impossible to breathe. Zanfretta was on duty that night and, as far as I know, he saved about 20 people. One by one, he took them outside to safety where they could breathe normally until the situation was under control and the fire extinguished. Very little is known about this. In chat they ask, what is the box that Zanfretta kept hidden inside a mountain? Do you know? Yes, it's part of Zanfretta's hypnosis account. He claimed to have received from these aliens a metal box, which opened to reveal a sphere, apparently made of glass or crystal, containing a three-sided tetrahedron. This tetrahedron rotated inside the sphere, producing electrical discharges. I must say, this is the only curious thing. I've never seen this sphere myself, and as far as I know, no one else has either. According to Zanfretta, the sphere was meant to be delivered to a famous American scientist, Joseph Holland Hynek, an astrophysicist at Northwestern University in Illinois, near Chicago, in Evanston. But this sphere, again, was only seen by Zanfretta. No one else could verify it. The three-sided pyramid inside a sphere is considered mysterious in geometry, a symbol of vital energy, a solid form within a sphere representing the divine will. This interpretation comes from certain private occultist circles. A viewer asks, in February 77, Zanfretta had a UFO sighting before the first encounter in December 78. Is this true? Yes, he recounted that in 77, a year before the main events, he saw in the sky a large luminous flying disc. He had mentioned it to colleagues, but no one took him seriously. It was an experience he had before the 1978 events. People also ask if Zanfretta feared secret services. Well, that depends. We have to distinguish between the 1978 Zanfretta or the Zanfretta of 20 years later, who often invented details that were neither in heaven nor on earth. For instance, he claimed that at the site of the first encounter, there were 3 holes 20 meters deep, later supposedly filled with water and oak trees planted by the Tariglia municipality. There is no truth to this. There were never any holes. Similarly, he once said his service car was found on a 20-meter high pine tree. The 20-meter figure recurs in these stories, but in reality, the car was on the road. In the book, readers can see photographs taken by the Carabinieri showing the Fiat 127 with its headlights on, exactly as it was found during the second encounter, not on a tree, but on the asphalt. He had provided some astronomical details, saying that this population of alleged aliens was called Joes and came from the planet Titania. Now, apart from the fact that the name Joes, well, I wrote it down. Anyone who's read the book knows. I wrote that it smelled of comic books from a mile away. So, these descriptions of aliens identified with certain names. Titania does exist, but it is one of Uranus' satellites, I believe, so I don't think it was the planet he was actually referring to. I even checked some of the distances in light years from Earth he mentioned at one point, and there was no real reference at all. Perhaps the only genuinely curious thing was the strange language he began speaking during the last hypnosis sessions. He started speaking an unknown language. I repeat, there are recordings, so anyone could verify, and no one has been able to decode it. I took a sample of this account in that language, made a tape, and brought it to the Institute of Glottology at the University of Genoa. At the time, I believe Professor Rapallo was there. I asked him to analyze it and see if it had the characteristics of a language, repetitions, linguistic structure, etc. He said it didn't match any known language, and they couldn't determine if it was a real language. A question comes up about the famous cylinders with various people inside, the spaceships, El Dorado, and other stories. First of all, he never mentioned El Dorado. That refers to the Spanish explorers of the 1500s searching in South America. What he did mention in hypnosis was seeing, when he was brought to visit this supposed spaceship, cylinders filled with a bluish liquid, more sky blue than anything else, and inside these cylinders were humanoid forms, including something that we might call a caveman. This is part of the hypnosis accounts. Another interesting part, Mauro Del Piane, mentioned in the chat, was one of the protagonists in this story. He was a night watchman. He was the one sent by director Gianfranco Tutti to pick me up at my home in San Pier di Arena around 1 a.m. and take me to Passo della Cala, where they were searching for Zanfretta. On the way, there was a rather peculiar episode. Del Piane stopped at the Scafera Square, where his colleague Andrea Pesci was. Pesci was over 1.90 m tall, very well built, fully armed, and crying out of fear. He asked to get in the car because he didn't want to be left alone. Del Piane told him he had orders from headquarters not to take anyone else, only me, so we left Pesci there. Later, we saw Pesci several times in Tariglia. He would relive those moments with great fear because he was the night watchman who had seen this enormous luminous flying disc over the hills and raised the alarm when Zanfretta disappeared. So he was one of the witnesses from the Val Bisogna area. A question comes up about the black liquid he allegedly urinated. Yes, it happened, right in the first sessions, between the first and second times. I don't think he lied because he was later subjected to a thorough clinical examination, and he really did urinate black, a very dark color, perhaps old blood, but he described it as a black liquid. Some ask if he ever saw himself as a young person inside the cylinders. Absolutely not. He never mentioned anything like that. Questions about regressive hypnosis and implants. Some suggested microchips or other grafts. He believed they had implanted a microchip in the back of his neck, where he had a kind of cyst. I arranged with Dr. Bartolini, I don't remember exactly, at the Salus Institute in Genoa to do a CT scan, which was also published in the book. Nothing was found in his skull. About the story with dolphins. He claimed that at night he went swimming, and dolphins would take him and return him to shore. I don't think there were witnesses, and I can't speak firsthand. These stories seem more imaginative than factual. Someone asked if recent interviews might have added details about the cylinders. They also asked if he had a twin who disappeared as a child. Never heard of it. He said his mother had multiple sets of twins, and he was born last, alone, no twin, never. Regarding hypnosis susceptibility, Dr. Mauro Moretti said Zanfretta was easily hypnotizable. Moretti was not a professor, but sometimes confused with Professor Marchesson of Milan. Moretti demonstrated once that during deep hypnosis, he could prick a fold of Zanfretta's skin with a needle, and Zanfretta didn't react at all, showing how deep his trance was. Another anecdote, Mauro del Piane and the Corso Europa incident. Frustrated with Zanfretta's repeated disappearances near Torriglia, the Val Bisagno headquarters sent him to Corso Europa, Viale Cortera, to check shutters and leave notes, then refuel. From then on, they lost contact with him. Patrols were sent out, one to Montefas, where they found Zanfretta's motorcycle cold, even though it should have been warm after the climb. Zanfretta himself was later found running down the road toward Uscio. In hypnosis, he recounted being picked up by the flying disc on his motorcycle and set down at the top of Montefas, terrified, running along that road, which was covered in fuel, emphasizing the same kilometers. Once, Zanfretta stopped me and said, you don't believe me. For me, believing doesn't exist when I'm working. Okay, I stick only to what actually happened, what I can confirm really occurred, what had witnesses, and what has corroboration. Beyond that, I don't go. Not at all, purely as a matter of principle. This certainly remains one of the most interesting cases in the global UFO panorama, and in the next episode of the Italian phenomenon, we will present an interview with Zanfretta's son. That's all for tonight. See you in the next episode, always on Compelling Topics.